Hello and welcome to the second technical webinar in the EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum series. Today we're going to talk about how radio frequency interference on satellite navigation can impact aviation and what we might do about it. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from all around the world. We have about 260 plus people connected. We hope there will still be more dialing in. I'd first like to introduce our excellent panel and thank you for your support. So first we have Nopodol Prigvanic. He's the global head of ATM engineering and aviation radio spectrum at the International Air Transport Association, IATA. Then we have Nikos Nikolaou, the chief operations officer in the Civil Air Navigation Services of Cyprus. Then we also have Jorge Chico Rossi. He's a senior radio comms engineer of the Space System Coordination part of the Radio Communications Bureau of the ITU in Geneva. And we also have with us Jean-Philippe Solé from just across the street, navigation and identification staff officer from NATO here in Brussels, just like EUROCONTROL. With that, we just like to remind you of a few housekeeping details. Basically, if you have any sort of technical issue, questions of a more administrative nature, please use the chat for that. And all your questions, you can ask those live in the Q&A. Also remember that if there's a specific question that you like, you click on the like button so that we make sure to answer the most relevant questions. Please accept our apologies ahead of time if we might not be able to answer all of the questions. And I'll also maybe take the liberty of grouping similar questions into one. Also, a reminder that today's sessions is being recorded and is being streamed on YouTube and LinkedIn. So just to set the scene, you have seen hopefully the think paper that we've done. That has just come out on Monday. And I'd like to just show a few pictures from that and a few highlights. And really the question is whether interference is starting to become an operational problem for air traffic management. You see in the slides, next one. Does it work? I'm trying to go to the next slide. I'm not pushing. Okay, there you go. So you see the highlights of the paper. I'm not going to go through all of those in details, but I have some slides that are talking about this a bit more. So you see here the slide from Airbus flight data recording. The only bias that is in here is that it simply is recording from wherever aircraft fly. So if there's interference where aircraft do not fly, then of course you do not see this. But this is flight data recording from aircraft as they fly around. And you see here quite a number of significant hotspots, specifically in the Middle East, but not only, also in other parts of the European network. So at EUROCONTROL, we took these hotspots and we analyzed affected FIRs, flight information regions. And you see that this is not just a Middle Eastern problem. You see that there are flights from the United States going to the Middle East. There are flights from Europe going to Asia that are transiting through these zones. And in our analysis, we saw that up to 5% of the flights could actually be needing air traffic controller assistance when they fly through this. Now, that number you've seen in green, what is the alternative DME area navigation capability. And so in those cases, that percentage gets reduced to maybe 2 or 3%. But in practical reality, that means over a large geographic region, over several months averaging, you do have a clearly measurable impact of radio frequency interference on the network, where on average, 1, 2, or maybe 3 aircraft could be needing special assistance from air traffic control and increasing both pilot and air traffic controller workload, and we will hear that more in detail from our panelists. since much of this appears to be linked to conflict zones, one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves, well, could maybe the military tune it down a bit? And we might talk more about this later. And you see here some simple calculations between comparing the impact of a 10 and a 100 watt jammer and its impact on an aircraft flying at en route altitude. And you see that with a 10 watt jammer, it's not great, but the maximum outage duration would be around 20 minutes, taking, of course, a couple of assumptions. That's not fantastic, but something that you can maybe still live with operationally. Once you start to look at 100 jammers or more, it starts to really be a radio line of sight kind of thing where you see that far and wide. On the other hand, the protection that you get on the ground against a potential UAV with some military anti-jam capability doesn't seem to be that much greater. So we would advocate that something on the order of 10 watts should really be the most power you should broadcast, especially if you don't want people to see you. But we will go into those details later. That's just to maybe give a couple of additional details and thoughts to the think paper, which I hope you have a chance to look at. And so with that, I'd like to not lose any time and go straight to Noppadal and have him give us the scope, the latest on how air transport is being affected by these interferences.
Thank you, Gary. Just a little crowd check first. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen? Okay, so it's all good. So thank you very much for EUROCONTROL for setting up this event. I mean, this is one of the very important topic from airlines operational perspective because it impacts both the efficiency and also the safety of our flight. So I will take these opportunities to go through with you what are pilot and airlines seeing inside the cockpit. What are the main problems or concerns that we see from having our GPS and GNSS being interfered? So let's see if I can move my slide to the next one. So why is it important? Why GPS and global navigation satellite system in general is important? Because this is a safety critical equipment. Basically, as everyone knows, it's a main driving force of the aircraft navigation system, but it's also primary requirements for INP operations, which actually allow the aircraft to precisely navigate it to various places, some of which have challenging terrain and a lot of operational limitations. So we need this system to work for the safety of both the crew, the aircraft, but also the people who are traveling on board and people on the ground as well. And GPS, GNSS is not only for navigation, it's actually supporting many things, including some of the safety, critical safety inside the aircraft. Of course, this provides position data for the navigation display, but as many of us are well aware, the ground proximity warning system is actually a system that alert the airlines and alert the pilots about how close the plane are to the ground. It's actually being driven by GPS and GNSS. In terms of air traffic management purposes, ADS-B, automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, actually driven by the position input from GPS and GNSS. So there's a multi-facet, multi-applications of GPS and GNSS signal inside the aircraft and inside the whole system of air traffic management. So why it's very important to us to having this system fully functional. So as you see earlier in Gary's introductions, there are some hotspot around the globe that from flying we see the impact of interference around the world. I'm not saying that the picture I show here on the screen capture everything, but this is some of the data we're receiving directly from the airlines report that's showing some of the hotspot between the period of 2019 and 2020. And as all of us know, some of these are pretty close to the areas with geographically and politically conflict zone. So that is some place that I'm sure that become a place of concern that we need to discuss about. So what exactly are we seeing inside the aircraft? In this slide, I know it's a lot of text, but this is the actual narrative that we receive from the pilots who flying, and then once they experience the GPS interference issue, once the flight is complete, they sit down and write down the narrative and provide the report to airlines management, and also in this case to IATA. So as you see here, I try to highlight a couple of things that actually show what is shown in the cockpit. What you see in the red letter is the type of warnings and alerting and the loss of functionalities that we see inside the aircraft. You see in here, failure of both GPS, the loss of INP, the terrain positions warning have been provided, ADS-B out are lost in that capabilities. And also what you see in the green is what aircraft or the pilot try to do to mitigate some of this. You see in some cases that once the GPS is lost, DME, distance measuring equipment, another nav aid on board aircraft are now being selected to drive the navigation system. Very often we see that the inertial system on board aircraft kick in and provide the continuations of the navigations. But we also seen as well that, in case of when we're doing approach and low-level operations, we see some of those concerning alarm that pop up. For example, as you see on the right side of the screen here, there's an alert regarding terrain. Basically, this is what the ground proximity warning system actually provided to the pilot, claiming that the aircraft is flying too close to the ground. Most likely because they start thinking that aircraft is the place there where it's not supposed to be. But in this case, once the pilot look outside of the window, and fortunately this is under the good visibility conditions, they say, oh, there's no terrain out there. So this is a misleading information. It's actually provide a pilot with some alarm when it should not be. So this is for us probably one of the most critical concern when it's actually driven pilot to make decisions based on some of the misleading guidance from the equipment. We actually from this resulted from the GPS being interfered. And in some cases, as you see in the yellow part of the screen, pilot need to, and this they done it safely because they check under the visibility conditions that there's no terrain. So they decided to ignore the warning. But is this something that we should be continue, knowing that it's not always under the good visibility conditions? So this is some of the main safety concerns that we need to look at. So there's a couple of things here inside this slide that I'm sure that any pilots here in the room, when you're looking at this, would highlight some of the concern that we see from the safety perspective. And also, as you see in some of the dark bold letters, this is the durations, 20-minute loss, 20-minute loss, and sometimes intermittent loss of the capabilities. So those are the various versions of how long the interference to GPS is impacted into the flight. So I just try to capture in the next two slides some of the insight that we learned from this interference report that we received directly from the airlines. Now, in the first slide, this one is talking about the en route operations where the aircraft is flying very high up in the sky. And of course, in most of the commercial air transport aircraft, we're using GPS in combination with the inertial system. So now when you have interference report, of course, airlines are concerned and we try not to fly into the interference reported zone. So in this case, it's somewhere around this portion of the airspace. But at the same time, we also know that in Syria, there are some ongoing conflict, military conflict. So we need to avoid that as well. So now when we put these two together, the question I always ask is that, if we know that there are GPS being interfered in one location, can we move to another part and fly a different route? But you see from here that, if this part of the red airspace here are being blocked, And also in certain part, in Syria, for example, there are military activities that we are not comfortable flying on. Then where should we go? The option is now being very limited. If you need to come through and maybe going down to the part of the Middle East or Asia or India from Europe. And this is the combinations of conflict zone and the GPS jamming actually create some of the concerning, both in terms of efficiency and safety of flight. And we do not have a lot of option of rerouting. And from the economic perspective, the route that linking Europe to Middle East and Asia is probably one of the driving force for the COVID-19 recoveries. When we are back flying again in a full capacity, we need this to work. Now in the next slide, in this slide, you see another insight that we received from looking at those reports, and now it's a little bit down into the level of the terminal area and approach operations. By looking at all this report that coming in the last 2 years or so, actually the report coming back to us a little bit longer than that. But you see that when airlines lose their RNP approach capabilities, the first thing they always ask is, can I fly airways approach? We need instrument landing system to be viable, period. This is the most preferred method of precision approach, particularly when we have a problem and some ongoing concern with GPS interference. We need that to be fully functions. We need that to be operational. So what would be the IATA, on behalf of the international air transport communities? We represent pretty much most of the airlines operating around the world. The next 2 slides captures some of the recommendations that we would like all the players, all the important aviation stakeholders, including the government and the state, to look into. Basically, there's a lot of things from the state level, starting from using the existing ICAO guidance and materials in managing this interference issue as a high priority, and also reports the progress or any difficulties to ICAO. We also highly, strongly urge the states when they and military to, when they need to use GPS jammer, please recognize the unintended consequences into the safety of the flight operations. And this is very important. And there are a couple more things that are highlighted in this slide. I'm not going to read through all that, but as you see in bullet point 4, for example, we need contingency equipment. We need some of the conventional infrastructure that can provide a backup. Not only just a backup, but it needs to be fully operational. Okay, this is something that we will never know for sure when the interference will be to GPS will occur. So we need that level of contingency procedures to be readily available and the infrastructure to be available for us to actually continue flying. And as you see in another slide as well, it's not only from that airlines are asking the government, we're actually asking on ourselves and our navigation service provider as well to be ready, to be prepared, to be informed, to make sure that our flight crew and our air traffic controllers are aware of this issue and have some conventional contingency procedures that are viable and ready to use. From the international perspective side, a couple of things that we ask ICAO to look into, and I'm sure that some of this discussion is already ongoing. What would be the global strategies for alternative position navigation and timing? Satellite navigation, GPS have served as well, but I think we also know that we also need to have another set of strategy and infrastructure that going to provide some reliefs in case of interruption. And we know that some equipment on board the aircraft, for example, the inertial system, can play a much bigger role, and it can be very helpful in many cases. For the ITU perspective, and we will hear from our ITU colleague later on, what ITU can help in mitigating based on the radio regulations, how international communities can work together in reducing or helping with some of these issues. So that concludes my remark at this point, and I'm looking forward to answer some of the questions and participate in the debate. But this is from the airline's perspective. This is the impact we see in the cockpit. So thank you very much. Back to you, Gary.
Yeah, thank you, Nopadol. That was an excellent presentation and excellent to show these concerning impacts. And one of the things that we're busy with here at EUROCONTROL as well is trying to figure out, how do you manage these things? Where is the boundary? I'll take just one question maybe from the chat for you. Yes, from Robert Westerberg. Is it realistic to rely upon conventional infrastructure as a backup? Should we not be looking at other technical backups? It feels kind of like me keeping a horse in case my car fails to start. So these nav aids, of course, they were designed in the 1960s. They have been modernized to quite some extent, so they're not the same thing in terms of design. But do you have any perspective on how should the backup infrastructure maybe evolve in the long term?
Yes, Gary, excellent questions. Well, there's always a question about what we need today and also what we should looking at in the long term. Okay, aircraft equipment doesn't change in a 1 year time or a short period. It takes time to recertify equipment. It takes time to develop a standard, a global standard equipment, and it even takes more time to put those equipment on board the aircraft and also be in place by the air navigation service provider. With that remark, aircraft are flying every day. So we need a short-term, medium-term solutions and also a long-term forward-looking. So to go back to the questions, what we need now is some of the conventional infrastructure like instrument landing system to be operational. And that probably going to last at least another 5 to 10 years, if not more. But at the same time, I would also encourage the communities and airlines is willing to work with the airframers and equipment manufacturers and ICAO on their system. What would be a long-term solution?
Yeah.
Okay, that is a PNT discussion, which may also involve the satellite navigation as part of the overall holistic navigation strategy. So that's two parts of the answer. What we need now, and what we should be also looking at into the future. Hopefully,
indeed, that was excellent, and that's also very consistent with the messages we have been sending out. We need to deal with the problem now with what we have, but we do need to look at the future. I do like the horse and the car comparison, actually. There's one other question. Do you have, from Jan Brutzart, do you have a view on the proportion of GNSS GPS jamming specifically aimed at compromising aviation? On our side, we don't really have any data like that, and appears that this is all sort of collateral damage that we're suffering. Do you have any clue on that, Nopadol?
Yes, Gary, the short answer is no. I think we are the one that impact by unintended consequences. Hopefully that's the case. Okay, if there is something deeper than that we don't know about, I'm sure that would be something that interesting to learn. But so far, based on what we see, it's not that people who jam the signal intentionally want to impact civil commercial aircraft operations. But we just happen to be there when the jamming occurred for other purposes, and we are using the same signal. For our case, it's for the safety of live operations, so it's concerning. But I don't think we are the original target of the jamming. Hopefully, what I'm saying is right. But
yeah, and I think it's just a byproduct of the fact that aircraft are actually flying at altitude, and so they are just exposed and they see this radio frequency interference.
And so with that, the same signal, and we're using the same signal with other people. So yeah, it's the same infrastructure.
With that, so Nopadol gave us an impact sort of global airline view. Now we zoom into more the local level, and we have Nikos Nikolaou from Cyprus give us a view from the operations room of air traffic control and tell us what sort of impacts that they struggle with. Nikos, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Gary. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yeah.
NOPADO has very clearly shown what the effects are to pilots. In my case, I would like to show the effects on air traffic controllers and air navigation service providers. I will also start with an example of the effects that GPS jamming has on the aviation system. In 2019, an Airbus 320 of a well-respected European airline, while on short final at Larnaca Airport, initiated a go-around in daylight and good visibility. The aircraft climbed 8,000 feet above the aerodrome without obtaining ATC clearance before informing air traffic that it was facing navigation difficulties due to loss of GPS. Fortunately, no other traffic was in the area at the time. The fact that the aircraft was on short final with very good visibility, and yet the pilot chose to follow a non-standard procedure and climb significantly above the missed approach procedure altitude, which is 2,000 feet QNH, is an indicator of the extent that pilots and airline operations have come to depend on automation. Automation that depends significantly on GNSS signals whose integrity is considered given. Cyprus Air Navigation Services have invested time and effort to adapt its airspace and navigation procedures, developing new routes, seats, stars, instrument approaches that use area navigation, which is dependent on GNSS. And yet, we witness more and more pilots that request to follow conventional routes that depend on ground navigates because they are losing faith in the availability of GNSS in many parts of Nicosia FIR. In addition, surveillance sensors and surveillance data are affected, especially ADS-B-derived position, as well as timing signals, causing aircraft radar tracks to deviate from the actual aircraft position. The Middle East area has long been suffering from military conflicts. Fighting forces in the area systematically jam GNSS as a means to prevent accurate navigation by attacking forces. As a result, civil aviation that has come to depend on GNSS for navigation faces a significant new threat. It was sometime into the conflict in Syria when air traffic controllers in Nicosia Area Control Center started noticing aircraft flying erroneously, and pilots started reporting GPS loss. Since the early 2018, Cyprus Air Navigation Services started collecting information from pilots and controllers on GPS loss events. Pilots report losing GPS and ask for vectors, increasing ATCO workload. They also report, sometimes too late, that they have to go around an approach or climb to a safe altitude due to erroneous terrain awareness system warnings, thus affecting airport capacity and causing air traffic delays. Pilots request to follow conventional routings based on ground navets instead of following more efficient RNAV routings, upsetting the air traffic control planning and affecting the efficiency of the system. All the information collected by Cyprus Navigation Services of such events is shared with EUROCONTROL and other interested stakeholders in an effort to raise awareness and gather support for resolution of the problem. There obviously exists a need to raise awareness to the risks that radio frequency interference of the GNSS signals creates to aviation and exercise political pressure so as to identify the culprits and resolve the issue. Technical solutions are also needed in order to harden GNSS-dependent equipment, as well as tools to support pilots and controllers with information on the presence of RFI, radio frequency interference, as well as standard procedures to help mitigate its effects. It is important to spread the word and do our part in minimizing the risks to aviation from GNSS interference. I would like to thank EUROCONTROL for driving these efforts. Special thanks to Gary for all the work that he's putting into this, as well as other organizations that support aviation safety through research and policies. I'm at your disposal, Gary, to answer any questions that we may have.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much, Nikos. That was excellent as well. And especially with your airspace where you can't put navigation aids into the water around you, of course, you have a special interest in doing things based on PBN, on area navigation. And it's also the kind of airspace where you don't want to get lost and stray into an airspace that you shouldn't be straying into. I know a little bit about your airspace, and it's really exciting airspace, so to speak, and that you have lots of spontaneous issues to deal with. And when I listen to you, it sounds like GPS is more than just one other problem to deal with. It does appear like it's, you know, one problem too many, because you're already very good at managing what is a complex and difficult airspace. So can you tell us how desirable it would be for these problems to go away?
Well, there are really two aspects into this. The first aspect is that we are obliged by regulation to implement GNSS navigation. And we, as I said earlier, we have spent time and effort to redesign our airspace, to design and publish new GNSS procedures, design new routes, etc. The main intention being to depend less and less on ground navets, which would bring more economies to aviation and more efficiencies to flying. And yet, this cannot be realized because of the interference to GNSS. So it can have a long-term effect in planning and in economics. And all this translates to costs for aviation and the environment as well.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Yes, indeed. So so basically you don't manage to reap all the benefits that GNSS would provide normally. So with that, we heard from the air traffic control side, we heard from the cockpit. Now we'd like to address more the radio regulatory side of things. And so we give the floor to Jorge to tell us more about how the ITU is and could be playing a role in helping us with mitigating or resolving these interference cases.
Thank you, Gary, and good day to everyone. First, before to go to the slides, let me thank EUROCONTROL and you for inviting us to be part of this panel. So I would like to share a few slides about, as Gary said, the context, the international regulatory framework, and possible action for this case, and in cases in general. And the reason why also it is important to have an idea first. I hope everybody's seeing well the slides. The reason why it's important to have an idea of the regulatory framework is because I remember once I was also in a forum like this one, and somebody say, okay, but what happens if this case, this scenario is in, I don't know, in international space, airspace, or international water, I can do whatever I want. And we say, no, I'm sorry, but you know, in those cases, it's exactly the same that if we are in the space. It is an international place, let's say, but everybody, like two GSO satellite networks, have to play a role and they have to protect each other. So plus, it's also important to measure the third parties which can be affected. So that's why we thought that it was important to start with a very briefly overall introduction of to what are the main provisions which are applied to any member state of the ITU and UN. So for those who are not familiar with ITU yet, ITU is an international organization, governmental, with 193 member states, a member of the UN system as well. And we count with more than 50 years of experience in space regulation. In fact, the first World Radio Conference for space issues was held here in Geneva in 1963. Today, there are more than 1,900 satellite networks operating, which account for more than 6 terahertz of spectrum, coordinated and recorded, and a low level of interference, of harmful interference. This low level, in fact, is more referred to those which are associated to these procedures, which, in fact, ensure a good quality of use of the spectrum. But unfortunately, sometimes it happens that we have cases of harmful interference, as we listed on the right side. So the cases we are receiving in ITU are mainly fixed satellite service, broadcasting satellite service in CKUKA, Earth presence satellite service for passive sensors in 1.4 gigahertz, mobile satellite service in L and S band, radio astronomy, and of course, the subject of today, which is radio navigation satellite service. We call radio navigation RNSS to GNSS in the L1 and L2 band, and we are going to go more deep in detail. So to set a little bit the context from the regulatory perspective, these 193 member states of the ITU are bound to these provisions, articles of the Constitution and the regulations. The first one, to give you an idea, is the definition of harmful interference. So if we look at here, we see that interference is defined as harmful interference is defined as interference which endangers the functioning of a radio navigation service. So first, we are especially defining the case of radio navigation service or other safety service or seriously degrades, etc., for any service which is operating in accordance with the radio regulation. So it's clearly identified the radio navigation and safety services. Article 45, again, of the same constitution, it says that all stations, whatever their purpose, must be established and operated in such a manner as not to cause harmful interference to radio services or other members. First two provisions. Another two, in this case, from the radio regulations. In addition to the Constitution, we have also a radio regulation which is more technical and specific for the case of spectrum sharing. And in this case, the provision number 15.1 speaks about unnecessary transmissions. We don't have a definition of intentional interference, of jamming or spoofing in the radio regs, which are more kind of commonly used in other fields, but we do have this definition, which says that unnecessary transmissions are those which are carrying superfluous signals or transmission of false or misleading signals, which this is the close way to associate it to jamming or spoofing. So there is a context. Number 1528, that's very important exactly for safety and regulatory of flights, because it says that they enjoy the absolute harmful interference. The administrations involved should act quickly. It's something imperative. So these are just four provisions which I wanted to share with you, but certainly in the radio regs and constitution we have plenty of them, and perhaps these are the four most easy to share. So what have we received in terms of interference to RNSS at the ITU? Basically, we have received two types of sources. The first one is the use of transmitting devices without the required license or authorization. Normally, it's a personal jammer. And for those cases, we encourage administrations to try to update and have an adequate legislation and enforcement mechanism at national level. No? This is also in alignment with the Article 18.1 of the radar regulations. And the second case, and this is the case we are, I think, dealing with in today, is the case of harmful interference occurring near zone of conflict due to military exercise or operations. And now we could try to speak a little bit slowly and focus on these other two articles of the Constitution. There is an interesting article in the Constitution, which is Article 48, which says that member states retain their entire freedom with regard to military radio installation. However, in the same paragraph, in the same article, it also says that this installation must, so far as possible, take measures to prevent this harmful interference. And perhaps this, so far as possible, could be what Gary was saying at the beginning, these levels of jamming, which may be needed in some cases, extreme cases, under this freedom that the military states have. So both things are contained in the same Article 48 of the Constitution. In summary, all these cases were reported to the World Radio Conference in 2019, which took place in Egypt in October-November 2019. And the member states, I think, were more than 160 participating. They observed that, and the Bureau, the ITU, Radio Communication Bureau, also encourage administrations, member states that for those that are dealing with the case of military exercise, please, they should evaluate the risk associated in these conflict zones or planning military exercise in advance, considering that this harmful interference can affect, for example, satellite-based systems which are in the area. No? So certainly there was an encouragement to the military sector to do more coordination with the civil sector. And this is, I think, a message which is perhaps one of the most important we want to give. Coming back a bit more to the general scope in terms of what ITU is doing or what can be done, we have different measures. The first one is prevention, which is coming from the compatibility studies which are given in ITU study groups, the radio assembly, the World Radio Conference, and the application of these provisions, technical regulatory provisions through the ITU and also the member states. When the issue occurs, there are corrective measures, which I will explain later in the Article 15 of the radio regulations, the application of the Radio Communication Bureau, and finally, at the Radio Regulation Board. It is important to highlight that we need to have this information. So we have developed an online system called CIRS to facilitate the information, the reporting to member states. So that's an important message we want to give to the memberships. So they should submit this and update this information. In addition to that, we also provide informative fora to raise awareness of the impact of these cases, because we believe it is important not to disseminate this through the regulators, but also in the civil society. For example, when we are dealing with the personal jammers, it's very important. Another field of action is the international monitoring system and the production of development of ITUR recommendations, reports, and handbooks. So in terms of prevention, for the case of RNSS, there is a resolution 609, which describes the procedures basically about consultation meetings between the stakeholders which are sharing the same bands in order to agree and maintain a common aggregated value of interference under control, no? In terms of EPFD and PFD. But also there are a set of ITUR recommendations which provides, for example, a description of technical characteristics of the systems. And here it's important to see that today we have several systems, so there are receivers with multi-systems, multi-frequencies as well, and different protection criteria, including for the case of aviation. So this is just for kind of further information. This is preventive measure. Corrective measures, and this is the case when the harmful interference is occurring. In general, when there is a interference between two satellite operators, it's not the case, but it's quite similar in the sense of actions. This case is normally dealt most of the incidents between satellite operators. No, the communication and the solution is between them. When this is not possible, is when the case is escalated to the administrations. No, when this is not possible, is when this case is escalated to the ITU. And in those cases is when we have basically two provisions, the Article 15 to report and inform the VR, and Article 13.2 to request the assistance. Normally we deal in this box of the actions, and when this is not sufficient, it can be escalated to the Radio Regulation Board. On top of that, there are two other legal instruments, which are the compulsory arbitration, which is in the Article 41 of the Convention. It's called optional protocol. Not all the members have signed, but there are several who have signed it, and they are bound to that. And also, in terms of settlement of disputes, there is an Article 56, which speaks about negotiation and diplomatic channels, which are useful as well. As far as I know, we haven't reached this level, but we did dealt always in this orange box. No? So this is in one screenshot how the system works in terms of reporting and resolving the case from the international regulatory framework point of view. Finally, because I'm sure that everybody is looking forward for the debate, but now we are providing more background information. Our key message is just to say yes, ITU is the place for cases dealing with harmful interference. We have, it's our main objective to ensure the harmful the operation free of harmful interference. We are aware of this case. However, I've seen more information than that we have received, and it's really a matter of concern for us. And we want to highlight again the issue of the reporting. The reporting to ITU is important because it's the only way we have to receive and assess this actual situation. Also, member states can request assistance from the VR under this provision. And something which we have observed in different cases, even though we went through FSS, VSS up to here, RNSS, is that the approach to be taken, and for example, I could even assimilate a little bit to some cases in the past, intensive cases in the VSS. So the approach to solve those cases is not one solution only. It's a mix of solutions and many organizations involved. And it consists of three aspects. One is the application of the international framework, radio regulations. Also the use of technologies. I heard about different systems with different frequencies, ways to mitigate it. And very importantly, the cooperation between the members or administrations and the space stakeholders. So only by doing this set of actions is that we can at least have the control at the minimum level of this harmful interference. And well, that's just a first introduction, and I will look forward for more questions or discussions later. Thank you.
Okay, excellent, Jorge, for this overview and all the various provisions that you that maybe many of us are not so familiar with. There was one linked to zones of conflict and duties also on states near zones of conflict. So I think that gave an excellent introduction to our next and last panel speaker, which is Jean-Philippe Solé. And so we'd like you, Jean-Philippe, to please give us the military's perspective on that.
Thank you, Gary. Can you all see my slide?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to this webinar. Already very interesting discussions, questions, and was checking the question and answer and the chat. Very interesting. I would just start my briefing with just a couple of slides on the fact that the aviation community is not the target of all this. I mean, that's already been discussed. It's more a collateral damage to what's really happening. And the basic idea is that we went from a navigation community that was for a very few or happy few people a couple of centuries ago to now, I mean, everybody has a smartphone. If you look at your latest smartphone, you have access to basically 4 global constellations plus a number of regional constellations. So it's a basic boom of all these applications. So satellite-based PNT is for us, military or the military community, became completely indispensable, crucial, or critical. But that's the same for the civil infrastructure and for civil applications, to include aviation. So we have created somewhere a reliance or a dependency to that very useful tool. Let me show you a couple of examples of which are not specifically aviation or targeted to aviation. The first one is well known. I mean, it's jamming in Asia, coming out of North Korea, and all sort of applications have been impacted by the jamming. I mean, the bottom slide of this one is more maritime. That was an exercise, a nice stuff done by IEEE a couple of years ago, where they basically equipped a commercial cargo ship, and that ship went around the planet, long trip, and they got a lot of reports of interference jamming over different places. Other examples were not just the aviation, but also cell phones or telecommunication were impacted by interference and jamming. The one on the bottom is interesting. That was a big exercise a couple of years ago, where it was interesting to note that GPS was jammed, but not GLONASS. And the last one is just because I'm from NATO, so I needed to put something on NATO there. That was an exercise that was notified and planned. So, I mean, people should have read the notice to mariner and notice to airmen. But I mean, that you have plenty of these reports everywhere. I've seen in the chat and some of the question and answer, people asking whether they were also spoofing. Yes, we have reports of spoofing. Not specifically on the aviation community, but we've seen reports of jamming on maritime platforms. So basically, the nutshell is that we are all using a nice capability, but that capability is somewhere weak. So the image is well known, but try to imagine a light bulb at 20,000 kilometers from Earth. That's basically the power of the signal that's coming from whatever GNSS constellation you want to use. So in one hand, we have this huge dependence on positioning, navigation, and timing. Of course, satellite-based positioning and navigation and timing, because that gives you nice, it's easy to use, good accuracy, it's global coverage, easy to integrate. Multitude of additional applications have been developed to increase, I mean, the performance of all this. Don't forget the T of PNT. That's also very important. And we have a lot of users using satellite-based time or satellite-based GNSS time. And the lack of NAVWAR integration consideration, I will come back to that later. NAVWAR is the buzzword we use in the military community. It's the lack of requirement or consideration on these potential interference and jamming problems. On the contrary, of course, the signal is extremely low power, so it's very easy to jam. It's so easy to jam. It's not very expensive, but it's very effective if you want to kill the signal. And we know that a lot of countries are actively developing this kind of technology and these kind of jammers. And of course, easy to develop, easy to use, easy to deploy. So that can happen almost everywhere without clear warning. So there's a real proliferation on these kind of counter systems. So we have a big reliance and critical dependency on GPS and GNSS. And it's not just an aviation problem. It's more global than that. It's really the capability that's targeted. In the military, we have what we call the NAV or navigation warfare. In a nutshell, I would refer to that as the 3P. And the 3P are basically preserve the friendly use, prevent the hostile use, protect the peaceful use and access of PNT information in, within, outside the area of operation. Recognizing that for us, military PNT and satellite-based PNT is extremely important, and we are using that in all sorts of systems and platforms. We need to make sure that we keep the capability to active and that we can use it, whatever the circumstances. So that's the reason why we've developed this concept, and everything we are doing when it comes to these interference or jamming issues is related to that in terms of requirements, specifications, capabilities, support measures, detections and localization of interference and jamming, everything related to that. Training, I mentioned training here. We have a problem, the military, in the training environment, because we have pretty good systems with some pretty high robustness and resilience. The problem we have is that how can we train and exercise in a sufficiently realistic environment to challenge these systems and platforms? And that's currently one of the biggest problems we have, is trying to organize specific areas where we can train, when we can define some non-permissive environment. But the basic idea behind all this for us military is that GNSS is just one sensor among others, or for you, I mean, GNSS with an S is just a bunch of different sensors among other sensors. Of course, all this is in theory. I know that at least for the organization I'm working with, the nations are applying this 3P and this naval approach. For others, there's a tendency to forget 1 or 2P out of the 3P. That works, of course, if you implement and stick with the 3P. And just for my last slide, just to throw out a couple of remarks or considerations or ideas or thought. The detection, localization, and notification reporting. I mean, we heard some briefing on this. I think it's still important. I mean, it's still enabled to provide official complaints, to apply the official procedures. I mean, to trigger some official dialogues and exchange within organization with different states. I think that's really important to document and get as many information and data as possible on all these event, interference, jamming, or anything. Consideration for the aviation community, you will have to work your requirement and specifications in a different way. You will have to include robustness, resilience, security requirement at the very beginning when you define whatever capability you need to use. And of course, doing that, you will have to ensure a little bit of coherence. We mentioned the use of PNT in ADSB. That's one example for me, which is amazing. I mean, if you lose PNT because you're using GNSS, you're using ADSB, so your big chunk of your surveillance infrastructure is just disappearing. Same with augmentations. It's nice to have all these augmentations to global systems, but if the global system itself is failing, your augmentation will not give you anything more. Performance-based navigation, that's, I think, good opportunity. But please do a real performance-based approach, because the performance-based concept performance-based navigation concept is very nice. You read the first page, the title, it's all about performance-based. Great. Second page, oh, you have to use that box, use that system, and revert to this and use DME. That's not performance-based. And I'm afraid that you're missing some of the latest development or new technology and architecture that are coming on board, where GNSS is just one sensor in addition or combined with several other sensors. And instead of using one system, oh, that system is failing, then switch back to another system. Try to use all these different sensor/systems together into a real navigation architecture or systems. Of course, do all that in a combined and coordinated approach, both ground and air, because that's the best way to be more efficient. Don't forget education and training. I think that's also, we went through all this in the military community and a couple of years ago, and it's still valid now. Some people are just discovering, oh, something is going wrong. Yeah, you're jammed. Oh, that's jamming. Okay, education and training is very important. Final bullet here, or the final one before the last, is certification. I sometimes get the feeling that certification is a limit or a restriction to what you have to do. For me, certification is, yeah, you need to do the testing and validation at the end that you meet all your requirements and specification, and you're good to go. So you will have certainly to work all certification aspect in line with what's been developed in that slide if you change the way you approach defining your requirement and your capabilities. And final remark, of course, there's nothing free. So there will be a cost associated to all this and to change all that. And that's all I have for you, Gary. Over to you.
Okay, excellent. So with that, we can go to the Q&A. And so let me just pick up on your last slide. You said nothing is for free, and you certainly my navigation systems engineer heart fully agrees that we should be doing integrated navigation systems that are truly performance-based. Now, the thing that does bother me a bit about that is that we have, roughly 100 satellites flying in space with by the 4 GNSS providers with significant ground infrastructure and operating costs behind it. And we've just heard from Jorge from ITU that there are all these provisions in place that actually say, yes, states should work together to keep this band interference free, etc. So is there no other choice but to go robust, integrated, more costly integrated navigation architectures, or is there a way to somehow encourage, just as is done with the arms treaties today, to go some path of non-proliferation? Is non-proliferation an option, do you think? Something that could be achieved in terms of military collaboration? Because it seems pointless to have all these fancy, expensive systems and then we go and jam them. In some cases, it's the same nations that are involved in that kind of jamming. So maybe you can elaborate on that conflict and see if non-proliferation somehow could be encouraged.
That's a very good question. I mean, I'm afraid the non-proliferation is coming a bit too late. And we need also to make some distinction between, I mean, not all states are doing that. I mean, some of the players out there, and you mentioned and you showed a couple of slides on the Middle East. I mean, not all the players up there are state players, and it's even harder to control them. Having said that, in an area of conflict or crisis, you have to expect this kind of interference slash jam. I don't really like the word interference. I mean, for me, it's jamming, and it's on purpose. It's really targeted to the capability, because some of the players there want to make sure that the others do not use the same capability or benefit from the same capabilities. So I think some of the procedures are mentioned as mentioned by the ITU and other organizations are in place. Let's use them. There's always some benefit to pursue that venue. What's perhaps missing is that, and I'm sorry to say that, but welcome to the world of the military. I mean, you will have to cope with these interference jamming issues more and more, or on a constant, permanent basis throughout the planet now, because nobody can hide from that kind of problems. So, but for the non-proliferation, to be fair, I'm not sure that will work. I mean, if you go on the internet and make some very simple research, you can find flyers on all these nice fancy capabilities, being able to jam different signals, different bands simultaneously with different types of jamming and everything. It's amazing. I mean, it's already free on the market, and you have people that can, I mean, you have phone numbers, you can contact these people, they will call you back, and they will they will try to sell you some nice fancy capability. It's a fact.
Yeah. So the thing that always bothers me about jammers, though, is you can easily locate them, and we're starting to see them. So thank you for those explanations, Jean-Philippe. I would like to maybe pick up something that Jean-Philippe mentioned. So we've seen the map, for example, Turkey, some of the other states around Syria have a lot of red in our heat maps. Is a state, and Jean-Philippe mentioned that may not be state actors, that may be other people, is in terms of also the ITU regulations, Jorge, is a state still responsible for maintaining a certain frequency band interference free, even if they don't operate GNSS systems themselves in that frequency band?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a good question, and we have heard a couple of times. I see similar question also during the chat. Indeed, the state is responsible for keeping the spectrum free of harmful interference in each territory. Now, and I'm saying, in the case of satellite network, we are referring to the state, which is having the control of that territory. Yes, we are not speaking about the satellite network, because satellite network is being affected as well. So what happens in this case is that, yes, it may happen in one conflict area that the state is not having the full control of the full territory. And sometimes they express this in the letters. So yes, and under the ITU constitutional regulations, they are responsible for having the spectrum free of harmful interference, but at the same time, they recognize, and in that particular situation, they don't have control of part of the territory. So this is also extended to the spectrum, not only to the ground, let's say.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned reporting, and you emphasized the importance of reporting. So now if an airline such as Noparol talked about is experiencing interference, could they be reporting that directly to ITU, or how does that work?
Okay, important. Yes, and I've seen also a similar question in the chat. We are really happy to see that the aviation sector is quite active and interested more and more in the ITU activities, as we see now. We have developed one online system exactly to facilitate this reporting, which is for cases of harmful interference, but also can be used for case of infringement of radio regulations. And why I'm saying this, because we'll explain a little bit of two different approaches. So if the airlines are interested to participate in the system, of course, they are more than welcome. The only thing which is needed is that because ITU is talking, let's say, with the member states, they need to be validated by one member state. So airline A, which is the flag airline of country A, should talk to the Ministry of Communication and say, I want to have a direct communication with ITU, let's say, no? So airline A, which is affected airline, could submit this report to its member state, to its regulator, and this regulator will just validate and send to ITU. And in the same manner, these airlines can read and access this database. Now, there is another additional point for the case of the airlines which are affected, because normally we could say, okay, somebody who is near this territory, we are speaking about the ground, would submit the report, because there is an interference affecting that territory, let's say, no, a neighboring country, for example. But sometimes the question was arising, what happened with the airplane exactly? So in those cases, and we have in one of these areas that you were showing, we have an administration which was very active in submitting information to the VR, to the ITU, even with the geolocation from the ground, which was very helpful for us to narrow down the area, and it's confirming the same data. So, but in the case of airlines, it's also quite important, quite useful, no? Because as you showed, and this is also I would like if the member state could update us with those information that you have showed from the airplane is even more interesting. So the airlines can certainly submit also to ITU, but as an infringement to the radio regulations. The difference is that in those case, any member state can submit to the ITU because it's been affected. Yes, so any airline which is being affected can talk to its Ministry of Communication and say, okay, please submit this to ITU, and that's how we could build all the more information. I think it could be very helpful. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, no, okay, that was excellent. So, and from what I recall, I think Nikos, Cyprus has actually done that process and filed with the Radio Communications Bureau. And if I recall right, that hasn't been successful, but that really is a process to follow. I'd like to ask you another question, Nikos, which, quite often we are in our GNSS world and we talk all satellite navigation. But have you seen cases of interference also to other parts of the CNS infrastructure? And can you tell us a bit more about what that is, what sort of headaches this is giving you?
Well, being in this area, we face a number of difficulties, including interference to ground-to-air frequencies as well. Most of Nicosia FIR is high seas airspace. There are many military operations taking place in high seas airspace typically, and we would often experience interference, be that deliberate or not, of the ground-to-air frequencies. In addition to that, we can experience interference from civil activities, especially from countries in the Middle East area who may not have such a strict enforcement status on transmissions and on activities for communication.
Yeah. So GPS is not the only issue, it seems, and I think that is also a significant concern. In the Think paper, we showed the figure of the DLR flight, and I was just curious, prior to the DLR flight, did you, I mean, I know you've been collecting a lot of reports, but did you, now that you've seen our maps and the IOTA maps and the outcome of the DLR flight, did you realize how extensive the jamming was before that?
Well, we had always suspected that the jamming is not restricted to one actor or from one area. Initially, it was all attributed to military using jamming in the Syrian conflict. We even identified through triangulation the exact position of one of those activities. But it was only after the DLR undertook the flights within Nicosia FIR that we realized how extensive GPS interference is within Nicosia FIR. We used to believe it would only be to the east of Cyprus, but now we realize, especially through the Airbus heat maps, that it affects a very big part, if not all of the Nicosia FIR, and even further west to Malta. So it would seem that there are more than one actors that create this issue.
Yeah, thank you for that statement. So with that, I think it's turn to go back to Nopadol, and one of the questions that was asked by Xu Gao from China and a couple of others. What's your view about the timeline of phasing out conventional navigation aids such as NDBs and V? Can you maybe state your views on how you feel? So in Cyprus, over overseas territory, it's not so easy to have those, but there's a lot of landmass where we have alternate navigation infrastructure. Can you say more about your views on phasing out that terrestrial infrastructure? No problem.
Excellent questions, Gary. When we talk about conventional navigation aid, I think we need to start breaking down to which one are we talking about. Okay, of course, we have NDB, we have VOR, we have DME, we have instrument landing system, and all of them have different level of uses in the modern aircraft. So let's get right to the point. For NDB, most of the aircraft are commercial operations in the big air transport aircraft. We don't really need it. Okay, so that is the first thing that can be looking at of stop using it. But of course, the spectrum itself can be valuable for others aviation purposes. So this different thing that we need to consider for that migration. Now, if we talk about VOR, a lot of the route structure today is still predicated in having VOR. So to create that transitions away from the VOR conventional based route, we have to work together to start working on that transition. And I think that applies to a normal DME as part of the VOR DME network as well. DME is a little bit different for RNAV. And that is something that I think is worth a long-term discussions of, is this something that's going to be useful? Okay, this is something that we need to talk and discuss in further details. Now, the last one is instrument landing system. I think you probably hear it loud and clear in my presentations. We need it, at least for the next 10 years, if not more. Okay, we learned this from the direct recommendations from one of the airlines, actually a couple airlines who are actually flying into one of the airports, that they no longer be able to fly RNP PBN approach during the jamming period. So the first thing they ask for is we need LS to be working. And unless we can absolutely dissolve this interference problem, LS must stay. Okay, so I think it breaks down to what conventional nav are we talking about. Is probably a disservice to the communities if we kind of bunch everything in together. Let's break it down to what we are not needed, what we absolutely needed, and what should be considered for the transition.
Yeah, so indeed we need to distinguish, and some rationalization, some optimization is certainly possible. But yes, I agree with you that instrument landing system will continue to be the workhorse of aviation, I think, for still some time, even though GNSS-based approach and landing systems can provide good benefits whenever they are available. I would like to go to one of the top-rated questions in the chat, and I'm not quite sure whom to address this to. From Alex Kowalski, could this affect the entire UAS and U-Space projects who are wholly dependent on GPS geofencing, etc.? So maybe if anyone from the panel has some perspective, and I think this is some new area of concern where maybe collateral interference might also be an issue due to people wanting to mess with unmanned aerial system operation. Anybody can offer a perspective on that?
I can try and offer some ideas on this, Gary.
Yes, please. Go ahead, Nikos.
For as long as UAS operations and UTM is restricted to low levels and over ground areas, it may not be so easily affected by the type of GPS interference that we are experiencing now, but it will be very easy to affect it. It was explained earlier by Jorge that even a very weak GPS jammer can have a significant effect. So yes, it could mean that UTM could be jeopardized in the future as long as it depends on GPS for navigation.
Yeah, excellent. Any other views on that? maybe on the military side, because I think you've had also a lot of experience with unmanned system operation.
Yes, I mean, it depends. It all depends on what kind of UAS you're discussing. I mean, the big birds are like big aircraft. So, I mean, at least on the military side, you really will have to really put some nice jamming up there to really interfere with these platforms. I'm more concerned on the small ones and the geofencing stuff and everything. It's an interesting question because every time GNSS, GPS is a very nice facility, but remember, I mean, look at the history. Why do we have these nice eBay personal jammers that everybody puts in his car or in his truck? Because we started to use GNSS to enforce some policies or to enforce some way of working or to enforce something. I mean, a toll road, or somebody wanted to track where the trucks are going. So guess what happens? People are reacting against that. They buy a jamming. What's the problem? Oh, they know where I am. They know what I'm doing. They know that I'm going through that road. Oh, I will have to pay that toll. Let's put a little jammer so they don't know where I'm going and everything. So it's a kind of a chicken and egg problem. But there's the counter reaction of all these kind of application. I see more the problem like this. Having said that, it's true that, I mean, you jam GPS or you jam GNSS because you want the specific user of that capability not to be able to use that capability and impact the way he operates, whatever system it operates. That's also valid for UAS. Having said that, some of the UAS do not need GPS or satellite navigation to continue to operate.
Yeah.
Over.
Okay. Yeah. So another exciting field.
Yes.
No, Padal, I think I really appreciated the fact, you know, we look up to the sky and we think it's a huge airspace and there's lots of space. But you showed us the routes that avoid the Syrian airspace, and you were saying that it's getting quite tight. You know, and I'm surprised that some of the routings that I see, they really go right at the border, at the boundary of Syria. We have seen, and not an inch further. So I'm wondering, you know, is there pressure from the airlines to fly the most efficient route, or what liberty does the pilot have in flying a route that is maybe a bit further away from all of these jamming area? How do you balance the trade-off between the need for you know, better fuel economy and with that lower environmental impact vis-a-vis safety, with something that is a safety risk, but you know, not a missile kind of safety risk, but it's a softer kind of safety risk? How do you balance that?
Well, it's a tricky juggling problem, Gary. Basically, of course, you know, we are, you know, allies also the responsible citizen to global communities, right? So, okay, environmental footprint, we want to, you know, we are actually required to minimize some of that, and we would be willing to do that. But also, you know, we need to take at our heart the responsibility, so ensure that the safety of flight operations. But we also working in the constraint of the network. So it's not like airlines can fly any route possible. You know, there's certainly limitation inside the ATM system, the route structure, the legalities of flight permit, many aspects beyond the economic fact of, you know, fuel consumptions and other things that come along with flying along the route. So this is thing that need to be balanced, and sometimes it's very difficult to balance when you have a very, very limited option, particularly if you want to go from one place to another place, but all 3 or 4 routes that make sense are blocked. So what are you going to do? You probably, you know, have to looking at way out. We are not fully in that hard place yet, but I think we're getting there with some of the difficulties that you see in some of the graph. So to keep my answer short on this one is, we do working on the limitation that we have. We are we're working very closely to minimize the risks. But of course, everything that's at the state level that can help to make sure that the safety of the flight operations are at their heart as well is very important. And we also count on the assisting hand from ITU and ICAO in that regard.
Yes, thank you so much. I see a lot of questions on the Q&A circulated around improving equipment and such, and we have certainly a lot of ideas there. And dual frequency multi-constellation is on the road in, and the need for finding the right balance with conventional system is clearly recognized, I think, from the data that we have seen today and from the various inputs that we have had into this forum. Unfortunately, I think we could discuss for hours more. It's time to wrap up. And so with that, I would just like to give each panelist still the opportunity, taking into account maybe also some of the questions that have come in, that just give us the last bottom line main takeaway message that you want to give us. So we'll start with Jean-Philippe.
Thanks, Gary. I mean, it's my main message or last remark would be that I still think that satellite-based PNT is still valid, but it needs to be addressed or used in perhaps a different way. I mean, the requirement part is extremely important, and that needs to be recognized. I mean, in the way you think in terms of systems of system or navigation architecture, more than the stovepipe approach, or I'm using that capability, that one is not working anymore, I'm using that one, and then I'm using a third one, a fourth one. I think that's we've learned that lesson years ago in the military, but it works.
Yeah, so more integrated systems thinking.
Exactly.
Thank you for that. With that, we go to ITU. Last words from Geneva.
Yes, well, maybe two messages in one. First, we all benefit from the GNSS. I think there is no doubt, and in particular also of traveling for civil purposes, so our business purposes. So I think we are all interested on that. So for the affected administrations, please report it to ITU. We know that we are aware, as we have seen, that it's not an easy issue, but there are also multiple things which can be tackled from the technology point of view that we were saying, also regulatory point of view together. So please report it. Airlines can do so also through the member states. And for the implicated administrations, in particular, as we mentioned before, for the case of, unfortunately, when there is a need of military operation or exercises, well, please try to coordinate in a manner that, well, the civil sector is not so much affected, because incidentally, as we are seeing, it's been affected. No? So that would be perhaps the best message. There is no magic solution, but all this together may help.
Yes, so comply better with the rules and framework that is there. And yeah, thank you. Nikos, Cyprus, your main message.
Thank you, Gary. Interference to GNSS exists and affects aviation. It can have an effect to both the efficiency, the environment, and it can also have an effect on the safety of operations. There needs to be action from everyone who can help resolve these issues, be those international organizations, states, commercial interests. IATA is a very important and organization that can make its voice heard on this issue. There is a need to develop technical solutions that would help mitigate interference when it exists, and there need to be developed standard tools and procedures to help pilots and controllers deal with its existence. Let's all put our effort and strengths into resolving this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikos. And so, Noparol, one very quick last word from you.
Yeah, well, I'll do it within 1 minute. Two very important points to summarize this. First, this is a complex issue with a very, very strong implications. So we need to work together. Everyone must play their part in solving this, and navigation service providers, airlines, equipment manufacturers, standard making organization, military, state regulators, both in terms of aviation and spectrum issue. We need to work together. We need to commit on moving things and solving the problem. The problem exists. The problem is important. It has the safety impact. Now, on the second side, second remark is we have the rule of the law in the radio regulations and in the Chicago Convention and the IQ. States who are committed to that are highly encouraged to follow up with their commitment and obligation. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So thank you so much to our panelists for this wonderful discussion of a very complex and hot issue that we have today, despite COVID challenges. Thanks also to the audience, and I've seen a bit of a lively discussion there ongoing. Clearly, this is a topic that requires more discussion in the technical and operational communities. So with that, our time is up. I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and like to just mention that we have other webinars coming up on the 24th of March on hydrogen planes, and on the 31st of March on cargo aircraft and the cargo industry, which has played a key role during these times as well. So with that, stay safe, stay healthy, and wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.